Good afternoon, everybody. This is Kevin Eskew, Director of Sales at TechExtend. I want to welcome you to today's session of the free webinar series, Maximizing Data Quality for Value and ROI. Today's webinar will be around the Irwin Macro Language Introduction and Case Studies. Today's agenda will include a brief description of TechExtend, followed by the Irwin Macro Language Introduction and Case Studies webinar hosted by Victor Rodriguez, Data Management and Data Warehousing Consultant here at TechExtend, followed by a question and answers period, and then a summary. TechExtend is a leading e-seller of developer and infrastructure tools. We can be found on the web at www.techextend.com, and Irwin falls under our database worldview ecosystem. TechExtend is an elite CA partner and the #1 data modeling reseller for CA in North America. We have an on-site dedicated CA sales and engineering team focusing on database modeling and infrastructure design and training services. We also are a leader in the delivery of CA education and an authorized VET VSA partner. Under our database worldview, we provide industry-leading tools for your end-to-end development needs, including defining, designing, developing, testing, deploying, and managing. So again, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, and without any further ado, I will now turn things over to Victor. Victor?
Thanks, Kevin. And thanks, everybody, for attending. Today we'll be discussing the Irwin macro language, and we'll talk about some, just kind of introduction to the topic and case studies. Hopefully many of you are familiar with this if you're longtime Irwin users, and if not, hopefully this will be useful for getting you started in automating some of the processes that you may have around your modeling. So first, we're going to speak about the agenda for the actual presentation. We've been touched on what are Irwin macros, then where are they available within the editors, where can you actually use them, and then we're going to have some demonstration as far as speaking about domain to column mapping, or I should say domains for column naming mapping, relationship mapping, and then index naming as well. So we'll also discuss other uses at the end, just kind of thinking outside the box after we've introduced all these different macros. Feel free to think about like how do we start to use this to automate some of the processes you're already doing day to day. And then we're going to have Q&A, so please do either, feel free to write your questions into the Q&A box on your WebEx editors, and then we'll get around to them at the end of the presentation. I do think we will have time to cover most of your questions at the end. So an important note I do want to touch on initially is that Irwin actually has two types of macros. Many of you may have already be familiar with this and have experienced this in the past if you're using the latest version of Irwin. Today's discussion is actually the old legacy macros. These have been supported since Irwin 3.x, and some of you may have seen code like this in the past. This is still used. It's still supported within the Irwin software, and as a matter of fact, all the triggers are still, the trigger bodies, I should say, are still all generated via this macro expansion. If you are curious about the TLX macros, these are the macros that are supported within the forward engineer template files, and that is a total different topic, and it's a very powerful set of macros that are, really useful in other contexts from what we're going to discuss today. But if you are curious about that, if that was why you were tuning in, then do go to that URL link there, bit.ly/Irwin webinars, and there is a topic there. I believe it was back in October or maybe even September, where I covered the forward engineer template editors, and we spoke in great detail about those macros. So feel free to reach out if you are curious about that as well. But for today, we're going to be talking about those legacy macros. And so what Irwin macros, what are they? They're a proprietary language. This is not, a custom, or I should say a standard programming language. This is a proprietary language that exists only within the context of the Irwin tools. It's string-based, so basically what you're looking at is comparisons, expansions, replacement, substringing, etc., but with string values based on model metadata. It's conditional. You have the ability of doing if-then, else statements, for example. It is somewhat limited. It's not a truly programmatic language or a fully programmatic language, but it does have a lot of the type of behavior that you would expect to see within a programmatic language. It's supported in many native editors, and I'll show you where you can actually identify that the values are supported or not. It's also supported in the script and stored procedure editors, and we'll look at that in some detail during the demonstration as well. What is not a fully a true programmatic language. So oftentimes users will come back and say, I created this complex nested loop and I was trying to pass variables in and out of, from one subfunction to another, and it didn't work correctly. And in a very limited scope, within 1 or 2 layers of logic, yes, it does allow these type of branching statements, conditional statements, but it is not a true programmatic language. Going back to the previous topic on the previous slide, the new macro language supported within those template files actually is fully programmatic language, and that may give you some of that type of behavior if that's what you're looking for. But for the discussion of what we're looking at today, this is not a fully programmatic language, but it does support a lot of the logic that programmers are familiar with. So identifying the macro availability within editors as well. Basically, you've probably seen this if you've used Irwin for a while, and you may be familiar with this behavior or not. But if you see a mapping value, like for example here, this is an Irwin R8 slide we're looking at, and where the arrow is indicating that we see the attribute name by default is inheriting the attribute domain name. So you're probably familiar with the fact that Irwin has these kind of standard behaviors. Your attribute name inherits by default from your domain name, and then that physical name maps by default from that logical name. And as a matter of fact, you can even apply naming standard files to kind of be the in-between point between the logical and physical side. The way this is all being actually implemented within the tool is by using this macro logic. And you can actually exploit that, use that to insert logic into some of these name mappings. So what we have here is wherever you see that percent and then at domain, if you're seeing that percent value somewhere in a mapped value, it basically means that there is a macro interfacing between the logical to physical naming from, in this particular example, actually from domain to attribute name. And so as soon as you see that, you can start thinking, okay, how can I use macros in this particular context? Here's another place where you see this as well. This is in the model naming options. So as opposed to this first screenshot here, we're actually looking at a domain object, and then the mapping is from the attribute name that inherits from the domain. In this particular case here, this is actually the model naming option. So this is the rules, the default rules for your objects at the highest level, at the model level. So we see there we have a rule from entity name or entity to table mapping, I should say, which is the entity name macro by default. We see the domain name mapping as well. Attribute to column names from logical to physical attributes to column. Relationship names have this generic rel name, which simply means that it's the relationship name from the logical side of the model mapping to the physical. And similarly, the key group to the index mapping. So what we're seeing here is you can actually manipulate these rules to customize some of this behavior. But this is yet another editor where you can see where we can use these macros. And to see a full list of all of the available macros, you can actually see from this editor, you can actually click on that macro toolbox button, and that will actually invoke the macro toolbox editor, which we're going to see in much more detail during our demonstrations. But this actually contains all of the specifications for all of the macros within the software. Now you'll notice here that there's categories for these entity level, relationship, attribute, etc. And what this is actually important because the context of the macros that you see within those different nestings are really depend on where they will expand within the context of the software. So for example, you cannot call an index macro from within a table, not usually, not anyway, but and so it depends on what context you're actually invoking the editors, and we'll see that in more detail. But that's why they're categorized this way. Attribute macros are available at the attribute level within attribute objects, entity macros, entity objects, relationship macros for relationships, and then we have the miscellaneous ones which contain a lot of the logic. So here's an expansion, for example, of the actual available entity macros, and there's one here, for example, this for each table macro, and this is a recursive macro that expands for each table in the model, pretty straightforward. And you actually see to the right, we have a description of what the macro does, if you're curious, in that description area, and we also have the sample syntax and even an expansion of the code, and that expansion is within the context of that little graphic to the right. And all those examples, by the way, in those graphics actually come from the eMovies model. So anybody who has Irwin installed has access to eMovies. You can open eMovies. You can actually copy and paste the code defined in your description there, and you can actually, actually play with this and get a good feel for how these macros work. So this is the best resource you have for actually understanding, what macros are available, at what level do they expand. description and sample syntax, and then of course a sample model for you to play around with as well. So general information, whenever you see these macros, you'll see that percent as the prefix that kind of indicates that this is a macro, and you'll see it different places within the editor itself. It's available in native editors, and expansion is always from the logical side to the physical. So there's no method, for example, of saying I have a physical model and I'd like to map those by default at the model level, have a mapping to the logical side. There are strategies around that, but it's something that we're not going to cover within the context of this webinar. But the generic is to start with a logical design and then map to the physical, which is usually the design process anyway. So general editor availability, macros are implemented as inherited properties in domains. So for example, where would you actually use these? You could actually see your column names are based on domain properties. So that doesn't necessarily just mean the string values themselves, but you can imagine like creating a user-defined property. If you've ever thought in the past, I have an alternate table name that I create a UDP around. I wish I could have a name expand based on that. You actually can. Model naming options, like I mentioned before, you actually have general rules for columns and index mapping. We saw that in the previous screenshot at that model level. And then in prescripts and postscripts, you actually have the ability of creating recursive scripts that expand. So for example, imagine you need to create some kind of custom grant that has some kind of logic based on the object that it's assigned to. Maybe certain tables have certain grants based, and you can identify them based on who the schema owner is or something like that. You can actually create these custom grants and then use these macros to replace, for example, the table name to use one string value versus another. But maybe in some cases I use the table name, in other cases I use this alternate table name from this UDP list. You can actually do that as well. So that's a little more of an advanced implementation, but you can see start to think of ways you can actually use that as added value. Also, it's stored procedures. So you may have stored procedures that you need to create, and within the bodies, you may once again have different logic that needs to be implemented in different situations. So you might have a generic stored procedure, but in certain cases, you have discrete times where you actually need to use a different body or different logic. You actually can do that by creating a stored procedure and then have custom expansion, simply using like an if statement based on that UDP that's assigned. We'll look at some of this or some of these concepts within the actual exercises we'll do in just a moment. And then triggers, all the Irwin generic triggers that you see generated right now, if you're familiar with seeing those, are all based on these triggers. I should say they're all based on these macros, and you can customize those trigger bodies as well. So if you ever have customized trigger bodies, you probably have experienced or run across some of these macros and some of the logic that's implemented there. So there are different types of macros as well. There's different types of values that you can, or different things you can do using these macros. So in very general terms, you have declarative macros. So for example, I can declare a value, assign a default value to it. I can assign a new value to that same variable as well. I can do arithmetic, so I can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division based on numeric values. If you have numeric values, you can also concatenate strings, for example, if you need to do that. You have branching statements, so you have if, then, else statements, and that is also supported. So that's a very powerful way of implementing multiple scenarios within a logical to physical mapping, for example, or within the context of a stored procedure. There's also Boolean values. This is actually very useful. So for example, you can have a flag to check, is this attribute role named or not? Is this a foreign key or not? And we actually see it in the branching example in the same screenshot that attribute is primary key is also a Boolean value that will let us know that we can use, for example, a particular naming standard if we have a primary key member versus a non-primary key member. So that's a very useful way of actually implementing something like this. And there's also looping functions. So oftentimes users will say, I would wish I could have the kind of macro logic you're describing, but I wish I could do that automatically for every single table, for every single entity within the context of a table, for every single index within a table. That's all supported. There are actually looping macros for all of those, and that is already built into the tool. You don't have to build it yourself, although you probably could come up with strategies for building it, but you can actually just use the canned looping macros, and it's a very great starting point for most of these endeavors you might need to be implementing. Other general usage strategies, you have the ability of communicating with external files. This is something that you may, for example, want to report. So you want to generate a CSV file based on some of these macro values, you can do that. You want to read a file, if you just want to read a variable that's external, you can do that. You can even use lookup files to read strings into your code and vice versa. So that's a really useful implementation as well if you do have external data you need to use within the context of your logic. Also enables your scripts to work with other objects of the same class. So that's actually probably the primary usage here, is to create generic logic that has multiple expansions depending on within the context of one class, but for different implementations. For example, one of the largest examples we're going to do during the demonstration is creating custom index naming based on index type. So you also want to enable your scripts. You want to make this generic. So maybe you have a generic stored procedure, a grant statement you want to generate depending on different Oracle versions, or maybe you want to just have generic code that you need to implement for Oracle or SQL Server. You have the ability of making the code generic. So you can actually make the code generic using these macros to replace some of the syntax with expansions that can be database specific. You can replace one DBMS delimiter with another, really basic things like that, which are supported within the context of the macro language itself. Other common macro usage. So here's just some examples of where you would use macros and the type of syntax you would expect to see. So for example, you might have a standard abbreviation or maybe an alternate abbreviation for an object, in an entity, right? So we have created a UDP, it has an alternate abbreviation, and I actually want to use that when it's available. I can actually use this entity prop with the UDP name within the syntax here, the way it's described, to actually expand that value in place of, for example, my table name. I can create custom index naming here, for example. So here I have created this index prefix, and then the key type, and then the table name. So it's a very generic, but naming standard, but something that I can use for all of the indexes in my model. And I can also automate string truncation there as well. So for example, you'll see this %, and there's a number in front of table name, and this is generic across all of the macros. If you want to just, for example, grab the first 7 characters, first 10 characters, first 20 characters of a string, you can actually just put the number you require in front of, between the % and the first letter of the string, or the first letter of the macro name, I should say. So %table name becomes %7 table name, and that simply will bring in the first 7 characters of the table name itself. So with that, let's get into our demonstrations and kind of see some of this in action. So here we have our Irwin screen here. I have a couple of different models. I'm actually going to start with my initial model here. I'm going to start with just a blank diagram, SQL Server. And I'm going to show you an example here where we use a domain naming option to just kind of automate some of these names. Now, this is often something that happens. I see users have their facts and dimension tables in a dimensional design, and they need to have different naming standards in the context of that implementation. And these names are generic. It's reusable. They use them oftentimes. They use the same type of behavior over and over again, and they would like to automate some of this processes as far as creating these namings from their facts or dimensions and attributes within there. So what we're actually going to do here is we're going to use a domain. I'm going to create a new domain here. I'm going to call it domain ID. And I'm going to go into the properties here for this domain ID. And you'll see that by default, the attribute name is going to be, it inherits the attribute domain name. So this is the default behavior. It's the behavior you're used to seeing. You normally would assign a domain to a table, or in this case, an entity, and then you would actually manually name it to something else. But let's say that you have generic behavior. So for example, I want to make sure my names are always uppercase. So we have a macro that actually does that. And the second thing I want to do here is I actually want to make sure that these are unique. So for example, this ID that I've created, I want this ID to be differentiated somehow when I add it to my in my different tables. So for example, I'm going to put in a macro here, which is %owner entity. And I'm going to exit out of there. And let's see the behavior here. So that worked correctly. It doesn't always, sometimes I mistype. I'm not the best typist in the world. So it actually expanded correctly. And what you'll notice there, so I've just dragged my ID into this parent table, and it says parent ID. And then in the child table, you'll notice that it, also inherits this parent ID. And the reason that it's doing that is because I'm using that particular macro, which is the owner entity. So the owner entity is what is the originating entity for this attribute. So I can take the exact same domain and actually drag it here into child. And you'll see now I have a child ID. So now I have parent ID and child ID. Parent ID is migrating from parent, child ID from child. It's a pretty straightforward way of doing this, and it's a very useful tool as well. I can create another new domain here as well. I'm going to call this one address. And I'm going to use the exact same macro here. So once again, %upper for uppercase, and %owner entity, and I will capitalize, although I don't think this is required. And then attribute domain. So with this, we have the same naming standard, but on a different domain. So for address, I can actually add that here, and it says parent address, and I drag it over to my child, and it says child address. So you can imagine this is really nice. You know, you can start really enforcing standards. But there's other really nice features here too of using this. Like let's say that parent actually becomes store. And let's say the child actually becomes employee. You see that the behavior of the model automatically changes to reflect the changes to the entity. So this is saving me a lot of time, and it's ensuring that my naming standards are correct because I'm actually creating those relationships between my domains, between my entities. And any kind of logic that you can always be thinking in the back of your mind, whenever I'm doing something recursively over and over again, there's behavior that's always the same across multiple objects. How do I, take advantage of these macros to, build that behavior? So I have a more complex model here. Actually, let me start with, I guess it's this one. Yes, this is the one I wanted to start with. So here's a design here, and I'm going to do a couple of exercises here. One that I'm going to implement here is to create standard relationship mapping names from logical to physical. And the second is I want to, and this is going to be the most advanced example we're going to look at here, is going to be to look at building a macro that allows me to create custom index names based on the logic of the objects themselves. So the simpler example here, we're going to actually go into our model. I should say, actually, I want to go into my actions, model naming options, which is what I was looking for. And looking at this editor, I did briefly introduce this during the earlier slide. What we actually see here is the mapping rules from the logical to the physical side of the diagram. So you also see that we can actually invoke the macro toolbox, which I'm going to do now. And I want to actually show you some of the macros that are available here. So you can actually see, like at the entity level, for example, the entity name, pretty straightforward. For each entity, it's a loop that goes through each one of the entities in the model. Pretty straightforward once again. For each index, pretty straightforward. And then other values here as well, like index type, which is something you can imagine is very useful when we actually are going to design the actual behavior based on index type. The names of the objects are available here, different values as well. So for example, at the relationship macro level, you can specify what is the child of this relationship, what is the parent, what is the entity ID on the particular object. This is actually the metadata for that object. What parent attributes are migrating. So very useful, like the verb phrase. If there is already a defined verb phrase, you can actually just invoke it here or call for it. Join FKPK, this actually shows you the join within the trigger logic itself, and that's something that really you don't use outside the context of triggers, but very useful if you do want to generate those trigger logic. Actually, also in stored procedures, you can build logic around the joining of information from parent table to child table as well. At the attribute level, of course, pretty straightforward. Most of the things you'd want to see, your data types, your definitions, default values, domains. Field name is simply just another alias for attributes. Basically, you're going to get the same value there, but the width of a field is something that could be useful in the context of your data type. And then some logic here as well, like is this an attribute foreign key? Is this a primary key? Is it role named? And this returns, of course, ones or zeros. It's Boolean logic based on whether it's true or not. And then, of course, you can create if statements around that logic. Physical data type, in case it's value, if it's different from the logical. Attribute properties, these are UDPs. Wherever you see something that has prop as its suffix, it's a UDP that's being referenced. So any attribute, you can create a rule based on the UDP value of that attribute. Domain values, and then similarly to so column properties, similar to that we saw attribute UDPs as well. You can also see other logic here, column data types, like what's the owner entity, and this is actually what I used in that previous exercise. So it returns the name of the entity. I'm just reading this from the actual definition. It returns the name of the entity that owns the current attribute. So if that attribute originated in a entity outside of the current one, it'll return that value. And that's how we got that unique naming in that first exercise, by the way. Constraint macros as well. Most of these refer to domains. Also refer to logic within your triggers, for example, like when the trigger fires on that relationship. If you want to see validation rules, you can also return those values here. So if you're looking, for columns with certain validation rules, you can create behavior around that as well, or simply return it as a string value if you need to report on it. And lastly, and maybe most flexibly, is these miscellaneous macros. So you have the ability, if you go through these, and don't have time to go through all of them, but I do want to touch on some of them, that whenever you see double ampersand, or double percent, I should say, actually, it actually means that this will expand as an actual string. So it will, rather than expanding as a macro, a single a percent sign always indicates to Irwin that this is a macro. If you actually want to explicitly print something out that begins with the percent sign, you need to use double percent. This is for declaring variables. Or I should say, actually, this is for returning the value of a variable. You have all the standard arithmetic operations, comparisons. You can see the generic, what you would expect to is equal, greater than or equal to, less than, etc. You can assign a value using the equal sign. You can use AND logic. You can concatenate strings. You can return the current database that you're connected to. If you have a live connection, this will return the user's name back as part of within the context of a macro, so you can actually execute different syntax based on who that current database owner is. The current file is simply the information about the currently open file. Your DBMS is your current DBMS. DBMS delimiter, of course, can change. For example, SQL Server, it can be Go, and for Oracle, it would be a semicolon, and you can actually modify that to make it reusable across multiple databases. Datetime is the current datetime from your operating system. File actually allows you to write to a file. If very powerful, is the ability of actually, writing a condition. You have max values, minimum values, not statements or statements. Lookup values here, which is a pretty powerful tool, but in specific context. Lowercase, uppercase, as I used in the previous example. But you can see some really powerful tools we're going to see in in the next exercise when we build an example ourselves. We have the ability of, for example, substituting strings, substringing within a larger string, a switch statement. So if you have switch logic, if you have 4, 5, 6 discrete values, you can create a switch statement around them. We did discuss briefly the TLX macros, which is the more expansive macros that are supported in the FET editors, and that really is really expansive. It contains all of the metadata within your model. If you'd like to actually use some of that metadata in your logic, this TLX macro, which was just added in the latest version of Irwin 8, by the way, this actually allows you to use those values from the TLX expansion of your metadata. So that's really powerful usage there. So for this example, what we want to do is I want to create a relationship naming macro between my logical and physical model. So I'm going to create a very simple logic here. I'm actually going to make this %parent underscore %child. And if I click OK, we'll see now, oh, I actually need to turn on my relationship names. And we see now that my relationship names actually have this syntax where we actually have our the joining of the both parent and child names here. So a very straightforward relationship naming macro. And you can see that in most cases, this will actually give you unique relationship names. So it's a pretty useful macro to develop and a very simple logic to actually implement. So you can imagine now that even just using something as simple as this can give you some more understanding as to what the relationship is between these parent and child relationships. Once again, this is available from tools, from actions, model naming options, and then this is your model naming options. And by default, if you default to this general tab, just make sure you go to the name mapping tab, and this contains all of the logic with the logical to physical naming. Now, the last exercise we're going to look at before we start taking your questions is going to be to look at creating your key group to index name mapping. So you're actually going to create custom index name logic based on your actual the actual type of index that we're creating names for. So we have unique naming standards for each one. This is going to be more complex, and the logic is not going to fit in this tiny little space here. So I'm actually going to show you a strategy of how you can actually develop some logic and then copy and paste it into here once you know it expands correctly. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to actually exit out of that editor. The first step is you want to go into your stored procedure, your script template editor. So the reason I like to do my coding within the script template editor is obviously this is a much larger, easier to use interface for developing logic. But we have to be in the correct, at the correct level of logic for this to work properly. So I'm actually going to just create this as a test, just because I just simply need this to expand while while I'm developing this simple application. And the first thing I want to do is make sure that I am at the correct level of logic. Now, when I go to my code tab here, I go to my macro toolbox, which I can invoke right from this icon. Wherever you see this icon, by the way, you can actually invoke the macro toolbox. And I want to be at the index level. So to make sure I'm at the correct place, I'm actually going to use these looping macros, and I'm going to say for each entity, and you see it just gets added to my logic here. And then within the entity, for each index, and then just to make sure that I am, this is expanding correctly, I'm going to, in each one of those instances, I'm going to return the key group name. And let's just look at the expanded, and we see here XPK and then the name of the table, et cetera, and so forth. So now this is just the first step of this. I know that this code is at the correct level. I am seeing my index names. So this is the step one. Make sure to kind of just make sure that you are in the context of expansion where you actually want the code to expand. Once we get to this point, we can actually start looking at actually building our code. So the key here is we want to replace this key name with some kind of custom, naming. So let's take a look at what we can do. the first thing you'll notice is that there's actually something called key type. So this is a really great starting point. You could say, okay, well, what does key type look like? Is this going to give me useful information? And it turns out it does. If we actually look at the expansion here, I see here's my index. And then here, it's hard to differentiate it here. Maybe I'll put it on a separate line. So here's XPK is a PK, XIF. So I see that I get the IF5, I get a PK. So for each index, I actually get a designator telling me what kind of key type it is. So it's a pretty useful piece of information. And you could imagine that this could be useful. At least the first 2 characters here would be useful, right? Because it indicates what type of index this is. This is a foreign key. This is a primary key. And then we'll see, if we keep scrolling down, we'll see some alternate keys as well. So this is the kind of information that I need. I need information that is generic enough to identify the object and uniquely identifies that type of object. So key type is going to be very important to the logic I'm going to generate here. Now that I know that I'm going to have a relatively simple set of values, I need to start cleaning this up. So the first thing I want to do is I actually just want the first 2 values, the first 2 characters in that string. So I'm actually going to use my substring macro here. And substring, the logic here is that you take it'll take the code, it takes the initial position, and then the final position that you'd like to capture. So that's the 3 values that are here. So I actually want to take my key type. I'm going to put that inside of my substring. I'm going to start with value 1, and I'm going to go for 2 strings. So now the result here, the expansion, once again, is just the first 2 characters. So PKIF, PKIF, and we've truncated that number off the end. So now this is a good value for identifying, is this a primary key, is this an alternate key, is this an inversion entry, et cetera, and so forth. So now we have a string that uniquely identifies each one of my indexes. Now, what kind of logic can I use? Now, I can create a bunch of nested if statements that actually will work. But even more powerfully is Irwin already has a switch statement. So I'm adding switch. So you can imagine here that I'm going to create a condition on my switch, and that condition is going to be this very string. And I put that in for my switch condition. And now my choose is going to be those strings that I've already seen come in. So I have PK as one, IF is another. We have another. AKs are another, so I'm just adding one more choose here to my logic for AKs. And then the default can just have the IE logic. Now, I am a very cautious coder, so I actually want to make sure that this is expanding correctly. Actually, let's make this FK, since that's what most people expect to see anyway. And we'll make this IE, IDX. And let's take a look at our expansion. All right, so my PK, FK expands correctly. Everything's expanding as expected. Okay, great. So now my switch is executing properly, and the strings expand correctly. But this logic, obviously, PK, IDX, is not a good naming standard. I need something reusable that identifies the table that's actually being used. So, for example, I can use PK underscore, and then the percent table name. Once again, using the macros themselves to create a unique naming standard within the tool. And if I look at my expansion now, I start seeing what I'm expecting to see. Now there's some other issues here as well. For example, all of these tables in this particular environment have this dev prefix. So I know that those are always there. So what I'm actually going to do is, rather than using my table name, I'm actually going to use my substring. And once again, like we saw with the substring, I can actually specify which character I want to begin with. And in this case, it's going to be the 5th character. And the last character is going to vary, right? It's going to depend on the length of that table name. So luckily, there is a macro here that returns the length of that string. So length is just generic, but I can put in the table name. And if I do an expansion now, just to make sure it works, I see here's my PK and my table name. So I can actually copy this logic and replace these as well. And now I go into my expansion here and I see what I was hoping to see. Now, that's great for PKs, but for FKs and other ones, AKs, etc., the problem is I could have multiple FKs, multiple AKs, multiple IEs in those tables. So how do I uniquely identify those as well? Well, conveniently enough, the actual key type, as we saw in the initial expansion, actually contains a suffix, which is 1, 2, 3, 10, 15, whatever it happens to be, which is the actual number there. So we can actually use that. We don't need it for the PK, but we can use it for the FK and the AK, and basically we're going to take the key type, substring of the key type, but just the last character. So we're going to put an underscore here. And rather than taking the first character for 2, we actually begin on the third character, and we don't have to put a end point on it. And let's make sure that expands correctly. And there we go. So now we're actually seeing that suffix number there as well. So I've defined this logic, right? Hopefully this was, I'm sure this was kind of daunting. This is not something you're going to do day one, but this is, kind of to show you the methods you can use, in the kind of thinking outside the box, that you can start something as simple as just your logical to physical name mapping, but something much more complex like what we're seeing here. And then what you would actually end up doing is copying all of this logic, just the logic that you created within the context of your loop. And once you actually created that, you would copy and paste it into this tiny little editor here and just replace your key group to index mapping. And I've actually done that in this other version. Which I guess is open already. Here it is. And if I actually go and look at, let's run a report here in the bulk editor, which I've already done. I actually run a report here in the bulk editor on the actual index type and the index name. And we see, for example, that in this case, I'm actually using UQ as for my prefix for my AK indexes, which is the difference here. But you see that I'm actually mapping these using, the suffix here from each one of those here as well. So this becomes a reusable way. And you'll see, for example, even though all my tables have this dev prefix, that I've actually stripped them out of my naming standards, so I have a nice clean naming standard here. My PKs all have this PK and then the name of the object, whereas my FKs have the FK with the name of the table minus the prefix, the table name, and then a counter at the end. And we see the same thing for our AKs as well. So this you start to see where you can make this, you're automating a process here. You probably have naming standards around your different indexes and around different objects, whether they're attributes, whether they're indexes, whether they're tables. A lot of this is actually, developed, your business users have defined these rules. And there are methods of automating the way that these strings map between, the logic between the different levels of the model. So I did want to mention, I guess I have a missing slide there, but that's okay. So I did just kind of wrap things up before we start taking your questions. Using the macros, as we saw here, it allows you to automate a lot and customize a lot of these redundant processes. So once again, some of the things you can imagine is you may have relationship naming mapping behavior that you need to automate. You may have index name mapping that you need to automate. You have domains behavior, like we saw in that very first exercise, where you have a domain rule, and then simply by adding it to in the context of a different entity has a different behavior. You can also have conditional behavior. So for example, maybe on different schema owners have different mapped values. Based on a UDP, you might have like alternate abbreviations and things like that that you need to map as well. So that's the type of thing that you can imagine using. Also remember that, like we just saw the logic that I created, I was just using the stored procedure editor or the scripting editor as a sandbox in that particular exercise, but you can imagine that you could actually attach that to expand after certain tables, and you could put grant logic in there, or maybe just definitions that might have references to external files, let's say, for example. So a lot of things that can be useful in that regard. You can ensure your naming policy compliance, like I mentioned before. Think outside the box, like I mentioned also. Make sure to think of like, how can I use this, not only in the context of just mapping these logical values to physical values or having conditional expansions, but think outside the box, like how can I use this? Maybe there are certain reports that need to be fired off at certain times. You can actually have behavior where when you're generating DDL, you can have an expansion occur. So start thinking, based on, go inside that editor, look at the macros that are available, and start thinking like, how can I use the things that I'm doing every single day to kind of tie together processes that might be related, within the context of Irwin, but also externally as well. And then, lastly, you make sure that, remember that you can customize that code to be execute on multiple database platforms. So it's a useful tool to have. And now, if you want to really get into it as well, if you want to customize that code for multiple databases, remember the forward engineer template files that we touched on, and check out that previous webinar, because that is also going to be even more powerful in that context. But that's really kind of like, where you can imagine using these macros, and, keep these in mind as you're doing things. Anything you're doing repetitively can probably be automated to a great deal using these macros. And with that, I'd love to hear from you all. Make sure you contact me. This is you can just basically Google search for Maximum Data Modeling, and you'll see all my social media channels. Make sure to link in with me or start conversations in our LinkedIn group, or just email me, and you'll see my email at the end of the presentation. And so I look forward to any questions you might have, and look forward to your questions right now.
Okay. One of our first questions is, our business people provide descriptions for entities and attributes in spreadsheets. How can we use these macros to load these descriptions from spreadsheets into the model?
The best way of doing that, you definitely want to check out my previous, if you are using Irwin R8, I should specify. If you're using Irwin R8, you want to look at my last video, which is regarding the bulk editor. The bulk editor is a tool that allows you to run a report on your any metadata within your model. You can export that as a CSV, and then you can actually modify the external CSV or the exported CSV, and then import that back into Irwin, and then update your model. So what oftentimes users will do, and this is something that we actually go through in that webinar, if you want to definitely check the replay of that, it's available on demand, it's free. And you actually have the ability of exporting, let's say, your entities or your attributes, and then aligning that in Excel with the definitions you have. You just simply copy and paste the definitions over, or just merge the two sets of data. Open that back up in Irwin, and then you can automatically update your model. So rather than using this technique here, the bulk editor is the most powerful method of doing that. If you're not using Irwin R8, if you're using Irwin 7.x, then reach out to the Irwin support team. 7, I see, okay, you are using Irwin 7. If you're using Irwin 7, reach out to the Irwin support team, and there is actually an API, which actually, I used to work in the Irwin support staff and wrote an API while I was there. It actually uses Excel to take that external information and populate your model from it. So that would be the technique I would describe. And once again, rather than using this technique, that API is going to save you. It's really the easiest way to go. You simply generate the report, you populate the definition field, you click a button, and it pushes it into your model. So that's the technique to use.
Okay, how can you use these macros in a table editor for default/validation constraint names without changing the SE templates?
I do know that there's an existing enhancement request in place right now. It's actually something that I opened myself, or with a collaborated with a customer in opening, regarding having that open. And I know that has been approved. So this is something that we'd expect to see probably within the next release or so, where you would actually have in the domain editor or attribute editor, like we saw today for those name mapping, that you would actually have the ability of putting using string expansions within the validation rules themselves. Currently, at this level, if you're using the current version of 7 or even 8, it's not supported. So there is, basically the answer is that there is no convenient way of doing it right now. You would need to reach out, use some of that new macro logic. But even then, it would still be a two-step process to get it back into the model. So unfortunately, the answer right now is that there's no real convenient way, but it is an enhancement request that has been accepted. So I would expect to see that, with the next release or so. And that's I know that that's something that's been requested multiple times. So hopefully that comes shortly.
Is custom code logic portable between the environments, example QA, prod, etc.?
Yes, the code that I described there is available. You can include it. Let's say, for example, you wanted to include just logic, and you can actually put that into a template file, or just put it into Irwin file, and then all your team members would have access to it. You can use that. That's actually a best practice to, if you have certain UDPs, reusable domains, naming standards, etc., you should create a template file that has all of them in there, or multiple template files depending on who's going to be accessing them, and then make those templates the starting point for your data modeling from that point on, because it kind of automates a lot of that standardization. That would be the general implementation I would suggest. But anything you develop in one version of Irwin or in one model, it is completely portable to another model. You simply just copy and paste the text after you define it, and it'll expand in any version of Irwin.
In relationship naming example, if there are multiple relationships between a parent and child, how can we ensure unique naming?
I was trying to keep things at as low level as possible in that relationship example, because I knew the next exercise was going to be much more complex. But there is logic you can put in there. You can create if statements. Maybe if you have a particular parent, you can have a certain mapping. You can use a lookup, which is something I didn't really touch on here, but you can use a lookup file to look at a text file externally to the model. So maybe you have alternate abbreviations for different types of names. You can use a lookup to do that. So rather than just doing a direct string matching, you can actually say look up this string in the external file and then use that abbreviation, and that way you'll end up with unique values. So those are techniques. That is a little more advanced, obviously, than just simply saying %parent, %child, which was, and oftentimes you are absolutely correct that, you don't always get the ability of seeing that, or I should say you will potentially see duplicate names if you just use a really simple string like that. If you do encounter that, then there are strategies. It is a little more advanced, so you have to use like another layer of logic, maybe using some kind of if conditions, or like I said, possibly a lookup, external lookup file with alternate abbreviations.
Can you please show the full macro you developed for the in-text names? Expand the whole screen to show the entire code.
I
think in the example you just showed.
Sure. If you want. Let me.
So the code itself is actually inside of my model naming options. And I actually need to copy and paste it from here, because unfortunately, this editor still does not expand. So I can actually put this into Notepad, for example, to show you. And I actually had backups, because I often mistype my code. So I had backup copies of my code in case, in case I made a mistake. I could always just copy and paste it from here. But everything worked correctly today. So let me just scroll down to that logic, and here it is if you wanted to see it. So this is the whole thing. I've actually removed the delimiters from it to make my make sure I don't get any extra underscores and things like that in my code. I don't even know if you can read that. I can email this to you if you prefer. If you reach out to me after the webinar, I can just email this to you, which is much easier than looking at it here on the screen, which is probably not the best way to look at it at this point. But if anyone who wants to see this, I can actually forward this off to all of you.
Okay, and it looks like our last question for the day is, using this macro language, is there any way to capture the UDP if we lost during the reverse engineering process?
If you've lost the UDP during the reverse engineer, not using the macros, but you can import UDPs between models. So if you've done a brand new reverse engineer, first of all, I do want to reiterate a point I kind of touched on earlier. I think it's a best practice to work with is to build a template that contains those UDPs and all this other behavior. So you have that in a template file, and then, for example, the next time you do a brand new reverse engineer, use that template file and everything comes over with it. Other general strategies, if you have reverse engineered from scratch and now you lost those objects because you didn't use the model you intended to, that's okay. You can complete compare the other model to your current model, import only the UDPs during the complete compare process, filter everything else out except for the UDPs. Third technique, and maybe my favorite technique, is to do the reverse engineer and then have that external file, this template file that I discussed, like this kind of ideal model that contains all these reusable objects and domains and fonts and colors and behaviors and trigger bodies and all that other stuff for UDPs that you've created within a custom trigger. Do the reverse engineer, and then what you do is use the add model source. It's available from tools add model source, and you're going to add the template as the model source. And what it'll do is it'll bring in all that behavior. So even after the fact, you can still bring in all that lost behavior simply by adding the other model as a model source. So that's my suggested best practice in that regard.
We do have one more question that just came in. Do you have a video on complete compare?
I'll have to look into that. I believe we do. And if not, maybe we'll just do a webinar on it. But yeah, that's a good suggestion. So that might be our next webinar. I do know that we have a new version of Irwin coming out relatively soon, and maybe we'll do a complete compare around that time as well. But I believe we do have an old complete compare webinar on that list. And once again, if you want to reach out to me after the webinar, we can forward you off the link to catch that replay.
Okay, it looks like there's no more questions. So for this afternoon, we'd like to thank everybody again for attending, and thank you, Victor, for hosting. Please look forward to our invite for next month's series. We wish everybody very happy holiday and the end of the year. Contact us, please, at info@techextend.com or at 800-221-7710. Thanks again, and have a great day.